Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. As we look at Daniel, we need to remember the previous two books that we just got done studying. We had Jeremiah, we had Ezekiel, and then when we consider this now, going into Daniel, what we have is a very interesting set of books. Now, not only are all three what we call the major prophets, along with Isaiah, which is a reference to the size of these books, not their importance, but there's another reason why these particular three prophets are so important: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And the reason is that these three prophets all overlap in time. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem when Daniel was taken captivity during the first wave of exiles in 605 BC. And Daniel was in Babylon, and Jeremiah was in Jerusalem when Ezekiel was taken into captivity during the second wave of exiles in 597 BC. Daniel is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel a couple of times, such as Ezekiel chapter 14. And later when we get to Daniel 9:2, we will see that Daniel will be reading the words of Jeremiah, quite possibly the letter from Jeremiah in chapter 29. All three of these men were serving the Lord at the same time, but in different ways and in different places, showing the variety and the providence of God as the Lord places us as he sees fit. And with that one observation, we begin to see one of the major themes in the book of Daniel: the sovereignty of God. That God is always on the throne, that he is always the one calling the shots, that while the kings of this earth have power and might, everyone and every created thing must bend the knee to our God. And we will see three times in Daniel chapter 4 this lesson: the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he gives the kingdom to whoever he wishes. Now, in verse 1 and 2, we see the same moment from two different points of view. From verse 1, we see this moment from the human point of view, that Nebuchadnezzar has laid siege to Jerusalem in 605 BC. In verse 2, we see the exact same moment, but now from heaven's point of view. The Lord gave Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Again, we see right from the beginning this theme of the sovereignty of God. He's allowing us to see it from man's point of view, but then he cleans it up and he makes sure that we understand that Nebuchadnezzar didn't conquer Jerusalem because he was great. He conquered Jerusalem because that was the will of God. God gave them into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. This split view of this moment will be important throughout this book because we will be repeatedly shown images of this world, its kings and its kingdoms, but they're presented uniquely. Nebuchadnezzar will be pictured as a tree. Alexander the Great as the he-goat of the West. We will see statues, bears, creatures that Daniel can't quite describe. We will see powerful world empire expressed in terms of their character and their sin, and we will see the powers of this world as they appear to God. And God will let us see them through Daniel's eyes. In verse 3 and 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar taking actions inside of Jerusalem. He orders Aspenaz, who was the head of the officials. Some of your translations said head of the eunuchs. The Hebrew word in verse 3 that is translated as eunuch or official is a word that literally means castration. And the way that it appears implies a valet, an attendant, someone who serves inside of a kingdom's court. Because of the context of the overall moment, and because we will see them keep announcing these folks as them or who, using that plural pronoun multiple times in verse 4 through 7, the implication is that the group in 3 and 4 are all going to become part of this group of officials, meaning that they would be castrated and indoctrinated in the ways of Babylon and made to serve the Babylonian king. This is the fate of the people in verse 3, some of which will include members of the royal family of Judah. Members of the line of David are going to be castrated, thus ending their bloodline, unable to have additional kids, and forced to serve in the court. It's a serious power move in the ancient world. I mean, it is a brain drain on Judah, right? It's removing the best and the brightest of Judah, adding them to the strength of Babylon. But it was also declaring to Judah that you need to stop rebelling. Because if I can do this to the best of you, I can do whatever I want. This was the unspoken form of the question that Nebuchadnezzar will ask in Daniel 3:15. Daniel 3:15, what God is there who can deliver you from my hand. And yet, despite this power move by the king of the known world, Daniel and 3 Jewish boys know who is truly sovereign. And we'll get to that in verse 8. First, we have verse 3 and 4. This is our only background information we have about Daniel. Now, we will walk with Daniel through the majority of his life, but his background is really kind of a mystery to us. Because verse 3 mentions some of the royal family and the nobles. Some scholars hypothesize that Daniel was a member of the royal family. We don't know that for sure. What we do know for sure is verse 4. He was good-looking and very intelligent. Daniel and his friends were among Jerusalem's most eligible bachelors. They were seized and forced to learn Babylonian ways. And if anyone had a reason to be bitter, it was Daniel, because he had lost so much. The Babylonians understood this. So in verse 5, we see that they tried to entice the captives with food and drink. Remember, they had just been removed from Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city. A siege was normally accompanied by famine conditions. So getting to go from famine to feast was meant to quickly convince the captives, hey, now you're on the winning side. That this is where you need to be. That the king of Babylon was going to be so good to you, he's even going to let you eat the food that he himself will eat. They were going to get the best of the best. All you have to do is surrender to Babylonian ways. In verse 6, we see an important part of the Babylonian indoctrination, name change. The changing of your name from the language of your people to a Babylonian name. Daniel's Hebrew name is Daniel, which means God is my judge. It's changed to Belteshazzar, which means Bel, so think Babel. Bel, protect the king. Hanani, which means Yahweh has been gracious or loved by Yahweh. His name was changed to Shadrach, which is a little weird. We're not sure. It may mean I am fearful of some Babylonian god, or it may mean illumined by the sun god. That the words are kind of difficult for us. Next was Mishael, which means who is what God is. It's a beautiful name. It can also mean who is like our God. But his name was changed to Meshach, which means who is like Shak or Aku, which are references to Babylonian gods. It could also mean I'm nothing before Babylonian gods. And the last is Azariah, which means Yahweh has helped. His name was changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. Not Mount Nebo, where Moses died, but a Babylonian god named Nebo, who was the son of the Babylonian god Bel, that Daniel was named after, or renamed for. All right? This was designed to be as humiliating and indoctrinating as possible. As Dale Carnegie would tell us, a person's name is the most important word to an individual. If you hear your name, you perk up. And to have that taken away from you is to rob you of a portion of your identity and to impress upon you that what the enemy wants you to be. And then we have verse 8. Verse 8 is so important because it tells us volumes about the person and the character of Daniel. This is one of those verses that you need to have like arrows next to. As we look at the early life of Daniel here, notice, we don't see him protest his name. There's nothing he could do about being castrated. But he could control what went into his body. He had control over that. And in that way, he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. What happened on the outside, he couldn't control, but it wouldn't affect his heart. What you call me, I couldn't control, but it would not affect my heart. But what I brought into my body of my own free will, Daniel would not defile himself that way. It would have been so easy for Daniel to give up. Notice in this moment, we only have the 3 friends and Daniel who go and they go this extra mile. But there are other Jewish people there too. They don't push back. They don't purpose in their heart not to defile themselves. But here, Daniel leading the group, he does. And perhaps he kept close to heart the words that were given to King Asa in 2 Chronicles 15:2. The Lord is with you when you are with him. The Lord is with you when you are with him. And if you seek him, he will let you find him. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. 2 Chronicles 15:2. In verse 8, we're told that Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself. He wouldn't eat food that was part of the food offered to the king. Most likely because that food was usually offered to a pagan god first. So it's like that king was eating food offered to the god, and then if they went and shared that, they would knowingly be eating food that was offered to pagan gods as well. The food definitely would not have been kosher. It had not been properly bled or prepared, and would likely include food that was not permitted to the Jews under the law. So Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not eat this food. But watch what he does do. He doesn't go on a hunger strike. He goes to the commander of the officials, and he asks permission to eat something else. Now, what this may have been is what Jeremiah shared with the Jews in Jerusalem in Jeremiah 27. Jeremiah 27. He told them, submit to the Babylonians. This is God's judgment upon you. Don't fight back against it. The Jewish people were to submit and serve the Babylonians. So in this moment, Daniel shows consideration. He shows good manners for the Babylonians, trusting that God would honor this purpose in his heart. In verse 10, we see that the commander has a heart for Daniel, but he's resistant to permit this because he's worried about what the king is going to do, that the king would be upset if he came and revisited and he saw Daniel and his friends looking all haggard. So what Daniel then does is he goes to the overseer who is under the commander. So you have a commander that's over all the eunuchs and all the training, and then you have personal overseers over these smaller groups. He goes to the overseer now. He's not trying to circumvent anyone's decision, but he proposes this 10-day trial for the diet change. What this does is it keeps the commander clean. It keeps him from being in the decision chain. But it also gives the overseer who saw Daniel more often limited exposure to danger because he sees Daniel every day. He'd be able to look as soon as he started to see signs, ooh, this isn't going well, we need to stop. And by this, Daniel shows such incredible wisdom. Anybody can find problems. It's so easy to be pessimistic. It's easy to point out all the ways that you just knew something was going to go wrong. But nobody likes to be around someone so negative. Instead, we need to be like Daniel. Don't just bring problems, bring solutions. And bring solutions that are at least somewhat acceptable to the other person. In verse 14 through 16, the overseer permits Daniel and his friends a 10-day vegetable diet trial, which again shows the favor that God has given Daniel. You think, well, he went into captivity. That means God's mad at him. Not at all. He's protecting Daniel in all of these ways. At the end of the trial, Daniel and his friends all look better than the other youths. In verse 17, we see how God blessed and imbued. He filled up Daniel and his friends with this fullness of knowledge, intelligence, and wisdom. So much so, when all the youths are tested at the end of their training, no one was like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And note how it's listed here. Their names have already been changed, but they're listed by their Hebrew names. They were placed in the service of the king of Babylon, and Daniel continued to serve the kings of Babylon until the first year of Cyrus the king. Chapter 2. In verse 1 through 3, we see Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And the contents of the dream greatly disturbs him. So he calls for the wise men to explain to him what the dream meant. Now, this response was very common at the time. We're going to see it in chapter 4, and we're going to see it again in chapter 5. But Nebuchadnezzar seems to understand how important this dream was. Now, in other places, he's not going to have this additional rule that he has right here. But he so needs to make sure that whoever gives him the interpretation gives him the correct one. He says, not only do you have to tell me the interpretation, you have to tell me the dream. It's the only way he can be sure that the interpretation is accurate. And if they can do that, then Nebuchadnezzar is going to reward them greatly. But if they can't, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be destroyed, which seems a little excessive. But it tells us a couple of things about Nebuchadnezzar. One, you didn't mess with Nebuchadnezzar. You did not fight against this king. Two, he is not patient at all. But three, he understands how important this is. Now, quick note in verse 4. In verse 4, we're told that the wise men speak to Nebuchadnezzar in Aramaic. If you have a King James, it may say like Syriac, which is a reference to the language of Syria, which was ancient Aram, which we know as Aramaic. Now, you may want to put like a parenthesis or an arrow or something like that right there where it says Aramaic. After that word, from here until the end of chapter 7, all the words are in Aramaic. They're not in Hebrew anymore. It's going to be in Aramaic until the end of chapter 7. So our Bible is in 3 languages: Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic, the common language of the Middle East area during this time. In verse 7 through 9, they again ask Nebuchadnezzar to tell them his dream, but he accuses them of trying to deceive him. You're trying to buy time. You're trying to trick me. They respond in verse 10, the only thing that they and Daniel will agree on. There is no man on earth who can do what you are asking us to do. And again, Nebuchadnezzar is known for many things, but patience and understanding are not among them. So immediately commands that the wise men be destroyed. When Daniel hears of the order, he goes to Arioch, who's the captain of the king's bodyguard. They would have been the ones in charge of carrying out this order. They're the ones closest to the king. And in verse 14, he speaks to Arioch with discernment and discretion. It's the same thing we saw in chapter 1. He understands a pretty basic rule. You catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And being ugly and snotty are not going to help. When Daniel heard the reason for the command, he goes to Nebuchadnezzar. Now think about the courage of this. He goes into the presence of the king and he asks for time so that he can bring an interpretation to the king. And the fact that he went into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar didn't have Daniel immediately killed speaks of the favor that God had already granted Daniel going all the way back to chapter 1. He knew he would be able to go in there. He felt pretty strongly that Nebuchadnezzar was going to give him time because that's how hard Daniel had already worked. He had done a good job. He hadn't been sullen or had a bad attitude. He gave his best effort, and Nebuchadnezzar is willing to give him favor here. But this is something that only God can pour into our lives. We do our best, but God opens doors that we can't. We saw the same thing with Esther in Esther 2:9, that even in the hardest of situations, God can make a way where there is no way. In verse 17, Daniel goes to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so as a group, they could go and seek the Lord for knowledge and wisdom. Again, notice the 3 friends are called by their original names here, not by their Babylonian names. Now, this is the last time that we're going to see their Hebrew names in Daniel. I'm going to keep referring to them by their Hebrew names, but this is the last time we see it, which is sad. But because it is the last time, it kind of stands out. And what it tells us is that the only way that they will receive the dream and its interpretation is because of their relationship with the Lord. They're not going to be able to interpret the dream because of their Babylonian training. That's why their Babylonian names are not used. Their Hebrew names are. It is based on the relationship with God. Only the Lord could reveal what the king wanted to know. They go and they seek God. In verse 19, God reveals the dream and its interpretation to Daniel. And the first thing that Daniel does is praises the Lord. This is such an important character-revealing moment for Daniel. It's really something to take notice. Don't run by it. It is part of the reinforcement that we are going to need when we get to chapter 3. And we start wondering, where is Daniel in all of this? Moments like this, and the boldness of his prayer in Daniel chapter 6, these moments communicate to us that Daniel was not most concerned with saving his own skin. Before he goes to Nebuchadnezzar, before he ensures his preservation, he takes the time to praise the God who sustains him. Verse 23 is the high point of the praise. It is a clear statement that what has happened can only happen because the God of Israel made known what no one else could know. The sovereignty of God. That God is over all things. In Daniel 4, Daniel goes to Arioch, and Arioch goes to the king. And what does he tell Nebuchadnezzar? King, I found a guy who could explain this dream to you. Now, it's funny. We look at him taking credit for finding Daniel. Daniel went to him, right? But we also need to understand this reveals the confidence that Arioch has in Daniel. Because again, Nebuchadnezzar is not known for his patience. If Daniel turned out to be a bust, it is highly probable that Nebuchadnezzar would have had Arioch executed too. So when he comes in and he goes, I put my name on Daniel, Daniel can do this. It shows how many people trusted Daniel, the favor that God had given him. In verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar asked Daniel, can you make known the dream and its interpretation? And in verse 27 and 28, we have one of the best moments in all of Daniel. Is Daniel says this, no one on earth can do it. No one on earth can declare to the king, but, and this should be underlined in your Bible, there is a God in heaven. Underline it. Put arrows next to it. Because those words are the answer and the solution to every single problem we will ever face. Whatever you are facing, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And that God has shown to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the last days. All right, that idea of the latter days, the latter days is the key to understanding the rest of the book of Daniel. And the majority of the prophecy moving forward in our study. The latter days is a very general term for the time period from between Jesus ascending into heaven, into the clouds, the birth of the early church, in the beginning of Acts, and until Jesus returns in the second coming. So from the time he goes up to the time he comes back down, that so far, almost 2,000-year period, is the latter days. What Daniel reveals here in verse 29 is that Nebuchadnezzar was lying in his bed having a very human, reflective moment. It's actually a moment of humility. It's one of those moments when you realize the frailty of your life, that someday you're going to pass away. And he's wondering what King Solomon will wonder in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, what will happen to my empire after I die? It's a very humble human concern. Because of this pondering, because of this momentary humility in the heart of Nebuchadnezzar, God gave him the dream, and God gives Daniel the interpretation. And the reason why God does these two things, gives Nebuchadnezzar the dream, gives Daniel the dream and the interpretation, is so that verse 30, Nebuchadnezzar could understand what was going to happen after he died. In verse 31 through 35, Daniel describes Nebuchadnezzar's dream. In his dream, he sees this great statue. The statue had a head of gold, which would, as we will see in the interpretation in verse 38, represents the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar specifically. Going down the body, the chest and arms were made of silver. This will be the Medo-Persian Empire. Its midsection and thighs were made of bronze or brass. That'll be the Greeks. Its lower legs were made of iron. That will be the Roman empires. And then lastly, its feet, the smallest body part. Its feet were made of iron and clay. Now, we know for sure what the first four kingdoms were because they're ancient history to us. What we see here is kind of like what we see with the parable of the four soils in the Gospels. This is the master key for understanding all the other prophecies that we're going to see in the book of Daniel. Everything that comes after this leans back upon this vision, this dream of the statue in Daniel chapter 2. As we go down the body from the head, each metal gets stronger but less valuable. Gold's the most valuable. But it's a soft metal. You can bend it with your fingers if you put a little oomph into it. Iron is very difficult to bend all the way down in the lower legs, but it's the cheapest of the metals here. What this expresses to us is the power of the overall kingdom. The kingdoms will get militarily stronger and stronger, but the autonomy of the rulers will get less and less. Nebuchadnezzar is called the King of Kings in verse 37. He's the head of gold. While his kingdom will be the smallest and the weakest of these world-ruling empires, he will have the most autonomy of all the kings that follow him. Even the next one, the kings of the Medes and the Persians, will have a larger empire, a stronger military than Nebuchadnezzar, but their kings were bound to more rules. Nebuchadnezzar could do whatever he wanted to do. Make rules, break rules, didn't matter. He could do whatever he wanted. But as we will see in Daniel 6:15 with King Darius, who is that ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire in that area, when he is tricked into condemning Daniel into the lion's den, he is unable to nullify his previous command. He immediately has less autonomy than Nebuchadnezzar. And when he tries to find some way out of it, his wicked officials remind him that once a Persian king makes a law, it cannot be changed no matter what. We see the same restriction in a book we already covered, Esther 8:8. And this pattern keeps going through all the way through the statute till we get down to the feet. And then we have this fifth kingdom. We see something unique. All right, I already mentioned it. The first four kingdoms are pretty clear. But there is so much speculation regarding this fifth kingdom that is represented by the feet and the toes of iron mixed with clay. Now, what we can pretty much settle on, we can all agree on, and is agreed upon by most scholars, is that this represents the Antichrist kingdom that will arise in the last days of the latter days, all the way at the end. Because it is partially made of iron, I present to you that it will somehow arise from the ashes of the old Roman Empire, which isn't particularly helpful because the old Roman Empire was so huge. And remember, there was a Western Roman Empire in Europe and an Eastern Roman Empire that outlasted the Western Roman Empire. That Eastern Roman Empire revolved around modern-day Turkey. So we don't know where this one is going to come out of. While this fifth empire will be strong and terrifying, just like the fourth, verse 40 through 41, it will be weak and unstable as well. It's going to be made of iron and clay that don't really mix, verse 43. Which doesn't make any sense. I mean, who would build a kingdom like this? What we do know for sure is that whatever the final kingdom is, and however it's composed, it will be crushed by a stone that was not hewn by human hands, verse 34. That's the one thing we absolutely know for sure. And only Jesus himself could fulfill this description. He is our chief cornerstone, Psalm 118, Matthew 21, in Acts chapter 4. Psalm 118, Matthew 21, Acts chapter 4. So his return is what's going to end this kingdom. So we can kind of work, from the end and work backwards just a little bit. When he returns from heaven, he will crush and scatter all the kingdoms that came before him. They will all be blown away like chaff on the threshing floor. But that stone will grow and grow in size until it becomes a mountain that fills the whole earth. It represents the eternal kingdom of our Lord, verse 44. And in closing to this interpretation, Daniel tells King Nebuchadnezzar, verse 45, and you can take it to the bank, because the dream is true and its interpretation is reliable. In verse 46, we see Nebuchadnezzar bow down and pay respects to Daniel. That's how overwhelmed Nebuchadnezzar was. He gives gifts to Daniel, but more importantly, he confesses that the God of Daniel is the God of gods who reveals what no one else can. Nebuchadnezzar promotes Daniel to be ruler. So think like CEO of the province of Babylon. And he makes him the chief of all the wise men. And the first thing that Daniel asks as the new guy in charge is for his three friends, presented using their Babylonian names, because he's speaking to the Babylonian king, but he places them in positions of authority over the province so they can help Daniel do his new job. Chapter 3. At the end of chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar extols the power of our God. And in the next chapter, Nebuchadnezzar shows what a problematic figure he continues to be. As the first thing he does in the next chapter is he sets about violating the dream that the Lord had just given to him. He builds this giant image, but this image is all made out of gold, presenting the idea that his kingdom will never end. Right? He's going to set this golden image in the plain of Dura. Dura is just outside the city of Babylon. And at his command, everyone is expected to bow down and worship the image that he made. So let's address the elephant in the room first. Where is Daniel in chapter 3? Why is Daniel not mentioned by name anywhere in the chapter? This moment seems to revolve around Daniel's three friends. And we know for sure that Daniel is still alive during this moment because he's going to show up after. He's going to show up all the way until the Persians show up. So since verse 2 indicates that all the rulers of the provinces were summoned, and we are told that only three friends did not bend the knee, does that mean that Daniel did? Now, most likely what is going on is that while Nebuchadnezzar summoned the rulers of all the provinces, Daniel was likely exempt from this moment because he was in charge of the capital city and because of how busy the capital city was. It doesn't seem wise to pull every official in all the empire and make them all show up. Someone has to continue to run the ship while these leaders are all missing. So likely the head officials of these areas would show up, but they left their second in command back home to keep things running. Daniel was not the top of the food chain in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was. So it made sense that Daniel was left in Babylon to run the city while the other representatives went to the plain of Dura. Now, if you accuse me of starting with a premise and then trying to justify it, that's a fair point. But this is a place where all that we have studied about Daniel thus far really comes into play. I think Daniel has earned the benefit of the doubt because we've already seen his character. We've already seen that he purposed in his heart not to defile himself in the small things, on the thing that would have been so easy to just go ahead and compromise on. And we know that his desire to praise God was more important to him than saving his own skin. Because when he received the interpretation for the dream, what's the first thing he did? He thanked God. He praised God. He didn't run to the king. But still, it's an honest question. Why isn't Daniel mentioned then in this chapter? And I submit to you that what God is doing here in Daniel chapter 3 is presenting an idea that we will see later powerfully in Daniel. We have already seen it in other books that for many prophecies there is an early partial fulfillment and then a final more complete fulfillment. And we will especially see this later on when we consider Antioch IV at the end of Daniel. What we see here just in chapter 3 is an echo of what we already saw with Enoch and Noah in Genesis chapters 5 and 7. In Genesis chapter 5, we're told about Enoch. We just have this one little humble verse about him, right? That Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. Then in chapter 7, God sends a flood that Noah and his family were preserved through. In that moment, Enoch wasn't just Enoch. He's also a picture of the church that will be raptured into heaven before the judgment of God was poured out onto the world. Noah represented the people of God, the Jewish people who were preserved through the judgment. And we see the same thing here in Daniel chapter 3. Daniel is a picture of the church before the tribulation starts. Before that time when the Antichrist takes the world stage, before he sets up an image to himself and demands that the world will worship it. And who are the ones who will be persecuted for their refusal to bow down to the image? In Daniel chapter 3, it's 3 Jewish boys. And they're going to be thrown into a furnace that per verse 19 will be made 7 times hotter than the furnace was before it. And how long will the time of Jacob's trouble be? 7 years long. In verse 3 through 5, Nebuchadnezzar gives the command. I want everyone to worship my image at a given musical signal. And if anyone refused, they are to be thrown into the fiery furnace. That's verse 6. Now, fun detail. If you do a search for the English word furnace, that word appears more in the book of Daniel than any other book. And all the times that it appears in Daniel, it appears here in chapter 3. Additional fun fact. The ancient word that is translated as furnace here in chapter 3 only appears in the book of Daniel. Why? Because, as we discussed, the ancient language in this section of Daniel is not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. There's this massive concentration of this particular word in this chapter so that we really understand what's at stake. In verse 7, we see that pretty much everyone who was present did what Nebuchadnezzar ordered them to do. Again, he's not known for his patience. Everyone, that is, except for 3 Jewish boys. Which, they weren't little boys, they were younger men, but you get my drift. In verse 8 through 12, the wise men whose lives were saved by Daniel and these 3 Jews. These same guys come to Nebuchadnezzar and they tell on him. They refer to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah by their Babylonian names. And a furious Nebuchadnezzar summons them in verse 13. And while we're told, verse 13, that he's furious, in verse 14 and 15, we see him speak with very nice words, which reminds us, do not blindly trust someone's words. Don't blindly trust their tone. I mean, he's so nice here. Guys, come on. Did you really not worship my image? You know what? I'll give you a do-over. And if you do what I want you to do, then great. But if you don't, I will cast you into the fiery furnace, and here we go, and who is the God who can save you out of my hand? As Bible students, we call that going too far. We read that, and we know that God is going to do something awesome. It's what we saw in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19, 2 Chronicles chapter 32. It's the boast of the Assyrians, like, who's going to save you from us? And we're like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. We know God is going to do something awesome here. When you tell us not to trust in our God, to even think that God could save us from the Assyrians or the Babylonians or anyone else, as Bible students, we can lean on moments like that. We know that God is going to do something awesome. But Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah do not have a fiery furnace moment to lean on because they're living it. In real time, they're going through this. They're living it out right now. So the magnificent words that we read in verse 16 through 18 are nothing less than just the bold declaration of their heart. It's an echo of what we read in Daniel chapter 1, in the heart of Daniel when he refused to defile himself. They tell the king, oh, Nebuchadnezzar, they don't even call him king at first. Nebuchadnezzar, we don't even need to think about our answer. If our God wants to, he is more than able to deliver us from this fiery furnace. But even if he doesn't, go ahead and understand, we will not serve your gods. We will not worship the gold image you have set up. Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar shows his true colors. We're told he was filled with wrath and hatred. Hatred was written all over his face. It said his face changed. It was disfigured. He ordered that the furnace was made even hotter than it already was. That's 7 times hotter, which means they're like pumping in oil into it, not just additional wood and fuel. Then they tied the 3 friends up. They tie them up so much they even tie their hats to their head. That's how tied up they were. They took the strongest guys in the entire military, and those soldiers ran toward the furnace, and they threw Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah into the furnace. And because the command of the king was so urgent, and the furnace was made so hot, these rough and tough soldiers died from the brief exposure to the heat. And if there was no hope for them, surely there would be no hope for these 3 Jewish boys. In verse 24, Nebuchadnezzar's just sitting there. He's enjoying the punishment when he suddenly jumps up and he goes to the high officials and goes, hey, didn't we throw 3 guys in there? They said, certainly, O king. Okay, then why do I see 4 guys walking around the furnace and the 4th one looks like the son of the gods? There is no way to explain what happens here apart from the power of our Lord. We saw in verse 24, they're totally tied up. They're completely helpless. In verse 22, the fire was hot enough to kill. And in verse 23, the guys definitely went in. We're told that they fell into the furnace. But in verse 26, we learn that they were so comfortable inside the furnace, they didn't walk back out. Nebuchadnezzar has to call them out. And the idea is not that they went in and that they jumped back out. They went and they're walking around the furnace, which should have been impossible because they were so tied up. Understand this. It's not that the furnace stopped being the furnace. But because of the presence of Jesus, standing right there in their midst, the furnace was powerless to do what Nebuchadnezzar wanted it to do. Remember, this is a picture of the Jewish people as they go through the 7-year tribulation. The really sobering thought for us is that there's other Jews among the officials of Babylon on the plain of Dura there. We know that from Daniel 1:6. They're not the only ones who were taken. Not including Daniel. There were other Jews who bent the knee to that golden god. But God was not with them. He wasn't with those who worshiped the golden idol. Instead, he was with these 3 Jewish boys who were bold on his behalf. As we already studied, as the prophet told King Asa, the Lord is with you when you are with him. In verse 27, these 3 friends came out of the fire. And the officials saw that while the fire burned off their bonds, which is why they're loose, why they're able to walk around in verse 25, but the fire burned off their bonds but didn't affect the guys in any other way. The 3 friends didn't even smell like smoke. So there's no lasting effect from what it is that they just went through. Nebuchadnezzar was so blown away that in that very moment he praises the God, and he uses their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Lord God was still not his God yet, but Nebuchadnezzar cannot deny what he has seen. What Nebuchadnezzar does understand is that their God is able to deliver from even the king's hand. And therefore, this is a God that should not be crossed. So with that mentality, he makes a command that if anyone disrespects the God of the Jews, then that person would be torn apart, and their house would be torn down. And even on top of that, he pours out blessings on these 3 Jewish boys. Father, we love you. We thank you for your grace.